This is a special investigative series from the Epstein Billionaires files. This is Part 1, The Architect. Ghislaine Maxwell. The name has become synonymous with one of the most horrific sex trafficking operations in modern history. But who is the woman behind the headlines? Was she a victim, manipulated by a powerful man? Or was she the architect, the mastermind who designed and built a global criminal enterprise? In this investigation, we will uncover the truth about Ghislaine Maxwell, from her privileged upbringing in the shadow of a media tycoon, to her role as the queen on Jeffrey Epstein's chessboard. Born on Christmas Day in 1961, Ghislaine Maxwell was the youngest child of Robert Maxwell, a Czech-born British media mogul with a larger-than-life personality and a dark secret. She grew up in Headington Hill Hall, a 53-room mansion in Oxford, surrounded by servants, luxury, and the trappings of immense wealth. But behind the gilded facade, there was darkness. Robert Maxwell was a tyrant, a man who ruled his family with an iron fist, who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience. Ghislaine was her father's favorite, the apple of his eye. She was charming, intelligent, and ambitious, and she learned from her father how to navigate the world of the rich and powerful. She learned how to manipulate, how to charm, how to get what she wanted. She learned that wealth and power could buy anything, including silence and complicity. Robert Maxwell's death in 1991 was shrouded in mystery. He fell off his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, in the waters off the Canary Islands. His death was ruled an accident, but many suspected suicide or even murder. In the aftermath of his death, it was revealed that Robert Maxwell had looted hundreds of millions of pounds from his company's pension funds, leaving thousands of employees destitute. The Maxwell empire collapsed, and the family's reputation was in ruins. Ghislaine fled to New York City, seeking to escape the scandal and to reinvent herself. She arrived in Manhattan in the early 1990s, a woman with a famous name, a charming personality, and a desperate need to rebuild her life. She quickly became a fixture on the New York social scene, attending parties, rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous, and cultivating relationships with powerful people. It was in New York that Ghislaine met Jeffrey Epstein, a charismatic and enigmatic financier with a taste for the high life and a dark secret of his own. Their meeting would mark the beginning of a toxic partnership, a symbiotic relationship that would leave a trail of destruction in its wake. Epstein was a man of mystery, a man who claimed to manage the fortunes of billionaires, but whose clients were never publicly identified. He lived a life of extraordinary wealth, with mansions in New York, Florida, and New Mexico, a private island in the Caribbean, and a fleet of private jets. Ghislaine and Jeffrey became inseparable. They were seen together at parties, at social events, at the homes of the rich and famous. Ghislaine became Epstein's companion, his confidant, his partner in crime. She introduced him to her powerful friends, she helped him navigate the world of high society, and she became an integral part of his operation. Together, they built a global sex trafficking ring, a machine that preyed on young, vulnerable girls. Ghislaine was the architect of this machine, the one who designed the system, who recruited the victims, and who managed the day-to-day operations. She was the one who lured the girls in with promises of a better life, who groomed them for abuse, and who silenced them with threats and intimidation. The machine was a complex and sophisticated operation, with a network of enablers that reached the highest levels of society. Politicians, financiers, celebrities, and royalty were all part of the scene, their names appearing in the flight logs of Epstein's private jet, the Lolita Express. They were the clients, the customers, the fuel that kept the machine running. The victims were the collateral damage, their lives destroyed by the insatiable appetites of the rich and powerful. They were the forgotten ones, the invisible ones, the ones who were sacrificed at the altar of wealth and power. But they would not be silenced forever. Their voices, once whispers, would become a roar, a chorus of defiance that would bring the machine crashing down. Ghislaine Maxwell was not just a participant in Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. She was the architect, the mastermind, the one who made it all possible. She was the one who identified the victims, who recruited them, who groomed them, who delivered them to Epstein and his clients. She was the one who managed the staff, who ran the properties, who ensured that the machine ran smoothly and efficiently. The evidence against Ghislaine Maxwell is overwhelming. Victim after victim has testified that she was the one who recruited them, who groomed them, who abused them. They have described in graphic detail how she would approach them, how she would befriend them, how she would gain their trust, and how she would then betray them in the most horrific way imaginable. One victim, testifying at Maxwell's trial, described how Maxwell approached her when she was just 14 years old. Maxwell befriended her, took her shopping, paid for her expenses, and made her feel special. But then, she introduced her to Epstein, and the abuse began. The victim described how Maxwell would participate in the abuse, how she would normalize it, how she would make her feel like it was her fault. Another victim described how Maxwell recruited her from a modeling agency. She was promised a modeling career, a chance to make it big. But instead, she was lured into Epstein's web, where she was abused and exploited. Maxwell was the one who made the promises, who set the trap, who delivered her to Epstein. The pattern was the same in case after case. Maxwell would identify vulnerable girls who were desperate for help, for support, for a way out. She would befriend them, gain their trust, and then betray them. She was the architect of their suffering, the mastermind of their abuse. Ghislaine Maxwell's role was not just to recruit victims. She was also the manager of the operation, the one who ran the properties, who managed the staff, who ensured that everything ran smoothly. She was the CEO of abuse, the one who made sure that Epstein's needs were met, that his clients were satisfied, that the machine kept running. The properties that Epstein owned were not just homes. They were crime scenes, places where horrific abuse took place on a daily basis. Ghislaine Maxwell was the one who managed these properties, who hired the staff, who set the rules, who ensured that the victims were kept under control. The staff at Epstein's properties were enablers, complicit in the crimes. They saw the young girls coming and going, they saw the bruises and the tears, they heard the cries for help. And they did nothing. They chose to look the other way, to prioritize their jobs and their livelihoods over the safety and well-being of the victims. And Ghislaine Maxwell was the one who hired them, who managed them, who ensured their silence. The machine that Ghislaine Maxwell built was not just a criminal enterprise. It was a symbol of everything that is wrong with our society, a testament to the corrupting influence of wealth and power. It was a machine that preyed on the vulnerable, that exploited the innocent, that destroyed lives. And it was a machine that was protected by a system that values money and status above all else. The victims of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were not just statistics. They were real people, with real lives, with real dreams and aspirations. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They were young girls who were robbed of their innocence, who were traumatized and abused, who were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The emotional toll on the victims has been immense. Many suffer from PTSD, from depression, from anxiety. Many struggle with relationships, with trust, with intimacy. Many have turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. The abuse has left deep scars, both physical and psychological, scars that will never fully heal. But the victims are not just survivors. They are fighters, warriors who have refused to be silenced, who have refused to give up. They have spoken out, they have told their stories, they have demanded justice. And their voices have been heard. The fight for justice has been long and difficult. For years, Epstein and Maxwell operated with impunity, protected by their wealth, their power, and their connections. They were able to silence their accusers, to intimidate their enemies, to evade prosecution. But the victims never gave up. They kept fighting, they kept speaking out, and eventually, their voices were heard. In 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was finally arrested and charged with sex trafficking. He was held in a federal jail in Manhattan, awaiting trial. But before he could face justice, he was found dead in his cell, his death ruled a suicide. Many believe that he was murdered to prevent him from testifying and revealing the names of his powerful clients. Ghislaine Maxwell went into hiding after Epstein's death. She disappeared from public view, living under assumed names, moving from place to place. But the investigators never gave up. They tracked her down, and in 2020, she was arrested at a remote property in New Hampshire. Maxwell's trial was a moment of reckoning. Victim after victim took the stand and testified about the abuse they had suffered. They described in graphic detail how Maxwell had recruited them, groomed them, and delivered them to Epstein. They described how she had participated in the abuse, how she had normalized it, how she had made them feel like it was their fault. The jury heard the evidence, they listened to the victims, and they reached a just verdict. Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty on 5 of 6 counts, including sex trafficking of minors. The verdict was a vindication for the victims, a powerful affirmation that they had been telling the truth. Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The judge, in handing down the sentence, acknowledged the suffering of the victims and the severity of Maxwell's crimes. The sentence was a message that even the powerful can be held accountable for their actions. But the fight for justice is not over. The client list, the holy grail of evidence, remains hidden. The names of the powerful men who abused the victims are still protected by secrecy and influence. The enablers, the people who helped Epstein and Maxwell operate their trafficking ring, are still free. The system that allowed Epstein and Maxwell to operate with impunity for so long is still in place. The culture of wealth and privilege that protects the powerful and preys on the vulnerable is still thriving. The machine may be broken, but the blueprint remains. This is the story of Ghislaine Maxwell, the architect of a global criminal enterprise. It is a story of power, of privilege, of abuse, and of the courage of those who dared to speak truth to power. It is a story that will shock you, that will anger you, and that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world we live in. In the next episode, Part 2, The Machine, we will dismantle the operation that Ghislaine Maxwell built, piece by piece. We will explore the mechanics of the trafficking ring, the network of enablers, and the system of abuse that allowed it to flourish for so long. This investigation is dedicated to the victims, to the survivors, to the fighters who refuse to be silenced. Their courage has inspired us, their strength has sustained us, and their voices will never be forgotten. The fight for justice continues. Let us delve deeper into the life of Ghislaine Maxwell, into the forces that shaped her, into the choices that led her down this dark path. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was not just a media mogul. He was a man with a complicated and controversial past. Born Jan Ludwig Hock in Czechoslovakia, he escaped the Nazis, fought in World War II, and reinvented himself as a British businessman. He built a media empire, acquiring newspapers and publishing companies, and he became one of the most powerful men in Britain. But Robert Maxwell was also a man with a dark side. He was known for his volatile temper, his ruthless business practices, and his alleged ties to intelligence agencies. There were rumors that he was working for the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, using his media empire to gather information and to influence public opinion. These rumors were never proven, but they added to the mystique and the menace that surrounded him. Ghislaine grew up in this world of power, intrigue, and secrecy. She learned from her father how to navigate the corridors of power, how to charm and manipulate, how to get what she wanted. She learned that the rules did not apply to people like them, that wealth and power could buy anything, including silence and complicity. The relationship between Ghislaine and her father was complex and intense. She was his favorite, the one he doted on, the one he saw as his heir. But she was also subject to his rages, his demands, his need for absolute control. She learned to please him, to anticipate his needs, to be whatever he wanted her to be. This dynamic would shape her relationships for the rest of her life. When Robert Maxwell died in 1991, Ghislaine was devastated. She had lost her father, her protector, her mentor. She had also lost her place in the world. The Maxwell empire collapsed, the family's reputation was in ruins, and Ghislaine was left to fend for herself. Her flight to New York was not just an escape from scandal. It was a search for a new identity, a new purpose, a new source of power. She arrived in Manhattan with little more than her name and her charm, and she set about rebuilding her life. She quickly became a fixture on the New York social scene, attending parties at the homes of the rich and famous, cultivating relationships with powerful people. She was charming, intelligent, and well-connected, and she knew how to work a room. She was also desperate for money, for status, for a sense of belonging. It was in this context that she met Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a man who seemed to have it all: wealth, power, connections. He was also a man with a dark secret, a man who was using his wealth and his connections to prey on young girls. Ghislaine saw in Epstein an opportunity, a chance to rebuild her life, to regain the power and status she had lost. Their relationship was complex and multifaceted. They were lovers, partners, co-conspirators. Ghislaine introduced Epstein to her powerful friends, she helped him navigate the world of high society, and she became an integral part of his operation. In return, Epstein provided her with financial security, social status, and a sense of purpose. But Ghislaine was not just Epstein's girlfriend or his social secretary. She was the architect of his trafficking operation, the one who designed the system, who recruited the victims, who managed the day-to-day operations. She was the one who made it all possible. The recruitment process was carefully designed to identify and ensnare vulnerable girls. Ghislaine and her associates would target girls from broken homes, girls who were in foster care, girls who were living on the streets. They would approach them with promises of modeling careers, of educational opportunities, of a better life. They would befriend them, gain their trust, and then betray them. The grooming process was equally insidious. Ghislaine would shower the girls with gifts, pay for their expenses, make them feel special. She would normalize the abuse, telling them that this was how the world worked, that this was the price of success. She would make them feel complicit in their own abuse, making it harder for them to speak out or to seek help. The abuse itself was horrific. The girls were subjected to sexual abuse by Epstein and his clients, often multiple times a day. They were treated as objects, as commodities, as toys to be used and discarded. The abuse left deep scars, both physical and psychological, scars that would last a lifetime. Ghislaine Maxwell's role in this abuse cannot be overstated. She was not a passive bystander. She was an active participant, a willing accomplice, a co-conspirator. She recruited the victims, she groomed them, she delivered them to Epstein, and she participated in the abuse. She was the architect of their suffering. The network of enablers that surrounded Epstein and Maxwell was vast and powerful. It included politicians, financiers, celebrities, and royalty. It included lawyers, accountants, and public relations professionals. It included housekeepers, pilots, and assistants. All of these people, in one way or another, helped Epstein and Maxwell operate their trafficking ring. They saw the abuse, they knew what was happening, and they chose to do nothing. The system that protected Epstein and Maxwell was equally powerful. It was a system that valued wealth and status above all else, a system that protected the powerful and preyed on the vulnerable. It was a system that allowed Epstein to escape serious consequences for his crimes for decades, a system that gave him a sweetheart deal in 2008, a system that failed to protect the victims. The 2008 sweetheart deal was a travesty of justice. Epstein was given a non-prosecution agreement that protected him and his unnamed co-conspirators from federal charges. He was allowed to plead guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution, and he served just 13 months in a county jail, with work release privileges that allowed him to leave the jail for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. This was not justice. This was a corrupt bargain that allowed Epstein to continue his crimes. The victims were betrayed by the system. They were not consulted about the plea deal, they were not given a voice in the proceedings, they were not given justice. They were treated as inconveniences, as obstacles to be overcome, as problems to be solved. They were not treated as human beings, as victims of horrific crimes, as people deserving of justice and compassion. But the victims did not give up. They continued to fight, they continued to speak out, they continued to demand justice. And eventually, their voices were heard. In 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested and charged with sex trafficking. In 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. And in 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell was a victory for the victims, a vindication of their courage and their determination. But it was not the end of the story. The client list remains hidden, the enablers remain free, and the system that protected Epstein and Maxwell remains in place. The fight for justice continues. The victims deserve to know the full truth about what happened. They deserve to know who else was involved, who else should be held accountable. They deserve justice, and they deserve a system that protects them, not the powerful. This is the story of Ghislaine Maxwell, the architect of a global criminal enterprise. It is a story that should never be forgotten, a story that should serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the corrupting influence of wealth, and the vulnerability of the innocent. It is a story that demands action, that demands change, that demands justice. The story of Ghislaine Maxwell is not just a story about one woman. It is a story about a system, a culture, a world that allowed her to operate with impunity for so long. It is a story about the corrupting influence of wealth and power, about the vulnerability of the innocent, about the failure of institutions to protect those who need protection the most. Ghislaine Maxwell came from a world of privilege, a world where the rules did not apply, where wealth and power could buy anything. She learned from her father that the world was divided into two groups, the powerful and the powerless, the predators and the prey. And she chose to be a predator. Her partnership with Jeffrey Epstein was a meeting of two like-minded individuals, two people who saw the world in the same way, who shared the same values, who were willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Together, they built a criminal enterprise that preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, young girls who had no one to protect them, no one to turn to for help. The victims of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were not just random targets. They were carefully selected, carefully groomed, carefully controlled. They were girls from broken homes, girls who were desperate for help, for support, for a way out. They were girls who were easy to manipulate, easy to control, easy to silence. The abuse that these girls suffered was not just physical. It was psychological, emotional, spiritual. They were robbed of their innocence, their childhood, their sense of self. They were made to feel ashamed, to feel complicit, to feel like they were to blame for what happened to them. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate strategy, designed to ensure their silence, to ensure their compliance, to ensure that they would never speak out. The enablers who surrounded Epstein and Maxwell were complicit in this abuse. They saw what was happening, they knew what was happening, and they chose to do nothing. They chose to prioritize their own interests, their own jobs, their own livelihoods, over the safety and well-being of the victims. They were not innocent bystanders. They were active participants in a criminal enterprise. The system that protected Epstein and Maxwell was a system that valued wealth and status above all else. It was a system that protected the powerful and preyed on the vulnerable. It was a system that gave Epstein a sweetheart deal in 2008, a system that allowed him to continue his crimes for another decade, a system that failed to protect the victims. The media also played a role in this failure. For years, the mainstream media ignored the story of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. They buried it in the back pages, they refused to investigate, they chose to protect the powerful rather than to expose the truth. This was a betrayal of their responsibility to the public, a betrayal of the victims, a betrayal of justice. But the victims never gave up. They continued to fight, they continued to speak out, they continued to demand justice. And eventually, their voices were heard. The arrest and conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell was a testament to their courage, their determination, their refusal to be silenced. The fight for justice is not over. The client list remains hidden. The enablers remain free. The system that protected Epstein and Maxwell remains in place. But the victims have shown us the way forward. They have shown us that it is possible to speak truth to power, to demand accountability, to fight for justice. We must follow their lead. We must demand the release of the client list. We must demand accountability from the enablers. We must demand reform of the system that allowed this to happen. We must never forget what happened, so that we can prevent it from happening again. This is the story of Ghislaine Maxwell, the architect of a global criminal enterprise. It is a story of power, of privilege, of abuse, and of the courage of those who dared to speak truth to power. It is a story that should never be forgotten. It is a story that demands action, that demands change, that demands justice. The next episode, Part 2, The Machine, will dismantle the operation that Ghislaine Maxwell built, exploring the mechanics of the trafficking ring, the network of enablers, and the system of abuse that allowed it to flourish for so long. The investigation continues.